Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the GCA Fall Forum. My name is Susan Wilbanks. I'm a member of the Grant Analyst team. Before we begin, please note that this is being recorded and will be retained for the legally approved retention period. It is subject to release under the Washington State Public Records Act, and it will be posted publicly on our YouTube channel. We have prepared material for the entire hour, including time to ask questions in each segment. And we do want you to be engaged. This meeting is for you. We do ask that you leave your microphone on mute and ask questions using the chat feature. And we should be able to answer those questions after every segment. Our agenda for the meeting, we will talk about the final action date, also late posting charges and the pending transactions form, awards issued in foreign currency, FOP 11 budget setup, advanced budget requests, mystery transactions, and some of the common errors that we see in invoicing and grant tracker. And this last topic is one that came out of a request from comments on a previous meeting. So when we say we want you to be engaged, this includes giving ideas for future topics. So I'm going to start talking about the final action date. This is something that it's an internal system deadline within UW. This is not something you're going to find anywhere on your sponsor award agreement, but it is the last day a grant or contract budget is open to status 1 in the UW system and is therefore the last day it's available for expenditures. So what happens after the final action date has passed? First of all, the budget will automatically close to status 3, which is the initial close status, and GCA will begin work on the final invoice and or financial report. And so this is something really important to be aware of because we may begin work on that report or invoicing the very day after the final action date passes. So when is the final action date? It depends on the award's financial closeout requirements as stated in the award agreement. This could be 3 weeks before the final financial report is due or 1 week before the final invoice. And typically, those final financial reports are most commonly due 90 days after the budget end for federal awards. But with other sponsors, it can vary quite a bit. So you'll want to know your award. And with invoicing, it's often 60 days after the end of the budget, but it can vary a lot. So it's very important not to assume that all budgets will be the same. Depending on your sponsor, depending on the rules of a particular agreement, it can vary. And if your award has early reporting or invoicing deadlines, say you need the final invoice 15 days after the budget closes, or the final report is due on the same day the budget ends, it will have an early final action date accordingly. In these cases where we have the very early dates, we will sometimes reach out to you to make sure that we have the information that we need for our invoicing and reporting. But just be aware that that will come very soon. And that's actually a good thing to try to negotiate during the pre-award phase. If you see that the sponsor is asking for, the final invoice and report on the same day the award ends or very close to it, you might want to ask if that can be negotiated. So, where can I find my budget's final action date? The quickest place is on the grant tracker budget information page. The example that I'm showing has a final action date in 2022, but if it were a budget that had a final action date within the next 90 days, that would be highlighted in red to help you make it clear to you. You can also use the grant tracker org code reports, which you can access those on the left-hand yellow side toolbar in the grant tracker system. And that allows you have various different reports you can view by an org code or org codes, and you can sort by the final action date. So why is the final action date necessary? Why can't the award budget just stay open until the day the final invoice or report is due? Well, mainly it's because preparing invoices and reports take time. It's not something that's just as simple as you press one button and it goes. And GCA does have to issue multiple invoices and reports each month. And we see especially high volumes 60 to 90 days after common award end dates. So if an award ends on June 30th or December 31st, 60 to 90 days after those dates, GCA will be very busy. And having that window between the final action date and the due date for the report or invoice gives GCA time to work with the department to correct any errors or problems that we find during our final reconciliation. And we hope that this can be a useful tool for departments as well. So we recommend that as soon as you get a new budget set up and it's available in Grant Tracker, check the final action date and use that as a goal to set up calendar reminders that allow you to complete all your financial activities by that point. And some of the ones that we see a lot of pressure to get in time are subcontract and vendor invoices, pro-card transactions, and expense transfers. And as I was noting before, having the org code reports allows you to sort a budget list by its final action date. Now, one question we often get is, how can I change my final action date? And the short answer is you can't. It's something that is system generated based on those final closeout requirements. And it can only change. For example, if the sponsor, having a little sound here. So if the sponsor extends the end date, if the sponsor provides an award modification that changes that deadline. But what if you have late posting charges? Hold that thought. We're going to discuss that a little bit later. So any questions on this topic?
Susan, there's a question in the chat, I believe.
Okay, I think.
Yeah, here. So the question is, will OSP try to negotiate out the final action date that is the same as the project end date, or is it up to the department to request it?
The final action date is, if you're trying to change, if what you're trying to change is the final invoicing or report due date that feeds the final action date. OSP, I don't think it's something they automatically negotiate. It's if you see that, you can ask them to assist you in negotiating for it, or you can work with the sponsor. Any other questions, Austin?
No, there are no more questions in the chat.
Okay. In that case, we will move on to the next topic, and I will hand this over to my colleague, Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle, and I'm going to talk about late posting charges and the pending transaction form. So if you have charges that haven't posted after the final action date, and maybe even after we've already issued the final invoice or report, we'll need a few things from you before we can reopen the budget for these additional charges. The first thing we'll need from you is the pending transaction form, which also needs to include an audit justification for the late charges. And the second thing that we may need, depending on the circumstances, is sponsor approval for either a late or revised report. And one thing to note about this form and your request to reopen the budget is that it needs to be reviewed and approved by GCA manager first. And also, if the charges are less than 200, we generally won't approve the request. Next slide. So what is the pending transaction form? This, some of you might already be familiar with this. It's on our website, and it's used to outline all the charges that still need to post to the budget. We ask that you be as specific as you can, listing out the object code, the transaction description, as well as any transaction references such as like the BPO number, and also include the amounts and its associated F&A and fringe. On top of that, we also ask you to include an audit justification for the late charges as these pose an audit risk. And one thing to note is that we often receive these forms without an audit justification, but it is mandatory. So if you leave this part blank or you don't include a justification in Grant Checker or maybe send it by email, we'll follow up with you first before we route the form over for manager review and approval. Next slide. So in this next slide, I'm going to go over what we're looking for in the audit justification. So there are two main things: why there are late charges and why they were identified after the final action date. And then two, what measures are being taken by the department to prevent delays and reconciliation moving forward. And I've also included an example of an audit justification that we received that addresses these 2 points. So in this particular example, the department saying that there were technical issues on the subcontractors end with submitting their final invoices, but that there are also disruptions with their usual processes due to COVID, and how they're adjusting those to accommodate the telework model. Next slide. So the next thing we're going to look at is sponsor approval. So whether or not we need sponsor approval will depend on a few factors, such as what are these pending charges, as well as when we received this request. So one situation in which we might want to check with the sponsor is if we received the request a few days before the final invoice or report due date. So since we need time to reopen the budget, post the charges, and then issue the invoice or report, there's a chance that we might not meet the deadline if it's a few days away. So it's good to check with the sponsor to make sure that it can be submitted late. And it's also good to note that the sponsor might have deadlines on their end as well for like reporting or closeout. And another situation is if we've already issued the final invoice or report. In this case, we want to make sure that the sponsor is okay with us revising the report or invoice to incorporate these charges. And regarding just the invoice, we also might want to check if they can accept a supplemental final invoice as opposed to an entirely revised final invoice, especially if they're already in like the process of like issuing payment for that final invoice. Next slide. So just as a final note, just keep in mind that the sponsor isn't obligated to accept a late or revised report or invoice, and we can't just go ahead and post more charges and then send something late and expect them to make the final payments. They can reject these late or revised invoices and reports, and if there's any resulting deficit, that generally falls on the department. So if you do have more charges, just make sure that you're following up with the sponsor for any necessary approvals in case these charges will impact the final report or invoice. Next slide. So just in this last slide, I've listed out a few resources regarding award closeout and late charges, and I've also included a link to our pending transaction form and instructions. And of course, if you have any questions about like the closeout process or the form, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Okay, there is a
Any
question.
questions?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat, Michelle. If the late charge is on a sub budget, should these be submitted in Grant Tracker under the parent or under the sub, or does it matter?
I don't think it matters. You can submit it under either because we'll see it either way.
That's all that's in the chat right now.
Okay.
All right, the next section is mine. I'm Cheryl, and I'm going to be talking about the most popular kind of award we can get, which is an award that is issued in a foreign currency. This actually is a really small population, but it is one that kind of has a higher fail factor as far as deficits go. So the first thing to know is if you get an award and it's not just a foreign sponsor, but the award is actually issued in a foreign currency, it means you really don't know how much you have to spend until you get all the payments in, I should say. It's not just the first payment. And so typically these are paid after the award is set up, and that makes it really easy to overspend. And so it's just kind of one of those things. One thing I always like to point out is whoever currency the award is written in, that's who's carrying the risk of meeting. Basically, if in our case, in this example I'm kind of talking about, is if it's in a foreign currency, we don't know the US dollar amount, so we are the ones carrying the risk. I'll go to the next slide, please. So some of there's three types that you typically will see. And number one is the pay in advance. Those are the best because the PI will know exactly how much they have to spend. And it's just easier to spend to that. The second one is real common too. It's a schedule payment or a milestone, meaning that as you meet a milestone, a payment might come in, or there's a schedule. Those are also okay. You will get fluctuation in the currency market with those, and you may end up with more or less than we anticipated. The third one is probably the most difficult, and this is where a foreign sponsor, foreign currency, and they want it cost reimbursable. And I think the intent on most of these is they just want to cover the costs. But what ends up happening is the process is really kind of complicated. You spend in US dollars, the end of a month or the quarter when we're sending that invoice out, we convert that total to whatever the currency is at that time, issue the invoice, goes to the sponsor, and they may take a month or more to pay those expenses. And of course, the whole time that's happening, the currency market is moving up and down and sideways. And so when that payment comes in, it's really unlikely that it's going to match those expenses, because we then are converting it from the foreign amount that the sponsor paid back into US dollars. We are working on or looking at ways we can try to make this better, because it's just tricky. But those are the three most common foreign award types you'll see. Can I have the next slide, please? I thought it'd be fun to have an example. I picked a nice old one so that you could see the full meal deal on it. So this is kind of what it comes to this one came to the UW. So it's from a German sponsor, and they've awarded us 30,000 euros. And this is like in 2016 or 2017, I think. So that's kind of like how you would know what the award is it's nice and clear, laid out. The next slide. So the first thing that happens when you see that in an award document and you're setting up your EGC1, I'm going to just say a disclaimer right here. GCA is removed from this pre-award process, and this is how I understand it, is that we understand that campus prepares the first conversion or kind of US dollar amount at the time that you're requesting the EGC1, and somebody can confirm or deny that. And the second is that OSP will update that when they're sending the funding action to GCA. That part I know is true. In this example, I'm still following my 30,000 euros. And so on the date that it was kind of set up on August 21st, item number 1 is showing the 30,000 euros. Item number 2, I've got my date in there. And item number 3 gives me an idea of how much I think I might get. And it's just an idea for that very minute that I've run this query. And it's about $35,436. Okay, so that's kind of what I think I might get. And we'll go to the next slide. So when it came down to GCA, it said $35,405. It's kind of like in the neighborhood. And so that's what we put in our system. And that's what you would see when you look in Grant Tracker, and also what you would see when you look in MyFD for the budget. The next slide. So when the wire came in, which was 45 days after all of, the award came down to GCA to set up, it was for $34,191. And the sponsor did a great, or the bank, I guess, did a great job. They identified it's 30,000 euros. They told us the rate. But remember, in our system, it's saying $3,400. And so if you were to spend to what the awarded amount is, you would end up with a deficit. So in this case, it's kind of important to look at the receipts. Susan, can we go to the next slide? One thing that we do, and one thing I'll also point out is in the OSP comments, they did make a note that the conversion was a little different on the day they sent it down to us. It was a little bit less. And there's a lot of disclaimers about if there's any loss, the department has to take it. And we always hope that that never happens. But with the foreign currency, you just have no idea. Okay, the next slide. And this shows kind of like, this is the very, very end. So the award and revenue have been adjusted to show the $34,191. That's how much we actually received. And I feel like the department in this case had done a really good job of being conservative. They didn't spend to the $35,400. They were a little bit less, but not enough. And they still ended up with a deficit of $1,140. And so you can see how easy that, it's just how that kind of rolled for this one. Okay, and the next slide. So some of the things we've kind of learned over the years, the best practices in the pre-award portion of a grant is try to negotiate for the award to be in US dollars. That's just makes it easy for everybody. And there's actually a lot of sponsors that will agree to that. If your sponsor is like, no, we don't want to do that, then you can try, the next best thing is if they can pay it in advance or schedule payment. And the third options, it's like, cost reimbursable. Those are rough. And if, I think there might be a little bit of room if their intent is to make sure that they're only covering the costs, which is what cost reimbursable is. The other thing to do is to kind of know how and when your payments are going to come in. And also to kind of know that the more time between now and when those payments come in, the more opportunity for rate fluctuation and influence by world events. I mean, you can kind of think of a couple that have happened over the last 5 years that really impacted the strength of the US dollar. And that's what really drives how much you're going to get. The stronger the dollar is against other currencies, the more of that other currency is needed to create a dollar. And that's why we get less. On the flip side, if our dollar weakens against like the euro or the British pound or something, one of the stronger currencies, we'll get more because it doesn't take as much. Okay, the next slide. I found, as I was poking around in my favorite foreign awards, I found this and I thought this is a really nice little layout that somebody had created for their award. You would just want to update it each year because I think this was prepared in year 1. And so it uses the same rate, taking the euro, and it's like, okay, well, year 2, we're going to get this, and year 3, we're going to get this. And if you updated it each year, I think it would be probably a nice little tool. I just happened to see that. Next slide. Some more best practices is if your award is in US dollar and your sponsor comes to you and says, we'd like to switch this over to our currency, you want to be really careful about that. What that typically would mean is that the dollar is getting really strong and the sponsor is realizing that they're going to have to spend more of their money. Basically, they're going to try to get rid of their risk and put it onto the department. Unfortunately, I've seen that happen and it didn't end very well. If your award we've received all the payments, hopefully GCA has caught that. Sometimes we don't, but if you know that, let us know. And what we can do is adjust the award and revenue to match the receipts. Again, to give it that visual, I'll call it, just basically to show the reality of what you're, this is how much you have. And it really helps, I think, when you just kind of only have a few seconds to look at a budget, because I know you guys have a lot of stuff out there. But anything we can do to help, I think we always are saying, let us know. I have a little link for our, we have a little page on our website that's kind of helpful. All right, the next slide is if you have any questions for me, and I thought I saw something.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. So will the UW allow foreign awards to be issued in foreign currency in the future state of Workday financials? What about service contracts?
Those are great questions. And unfortunately, we have very little insight into what Workday and such things are going to do. I would think yes, because it's a real thing, and I can't imagine saying no to that. So like, these are legitimate awards. I also would point out, in a similar vein to foreign currency, is if you're a sponsor, and I can think offhand of two foundations who pay in shares of stock. It's the same thing. They're not giving us dollars. They're giving us an estimated dollar amount. And sometimes we get more and sometimes we get less, but the underlying currency in that case would be shares of stock, fluctuates. So I wish I could answer your question about the future state, but I just don't know. All right. Thank you.
All right, so I'm Austin, and I'll be talking about a couple things. The first is setting up budgets with form of payment 11. So awards that GCA does not invoice for are set up in the financial system with form of payment 11 or FOP 11. Your department is responsible for billing on these awards, collecting and applying payments. The common types of grants which fall under this category are clinical trials or those with patient costs. Gifts and non-grant budgets, some other ones are also FOP 11. If GCA does not know a budget should be set up with FOP 11 and we set it up in our billing system, it can be tricky and time consuming to correct. When this happens, usually the sponsor is billed incorrectly, and depending on the situation, this may go unnoticed for a long period of time. The longer this goes on, there's more erroneous billing and a more complex correction. Next slide. A commonly seen situation is an award with a patient cost payment schedule that resembles a milestone type grant payment schedule. If we receive an award like this and it's not clearly called out that your department should be billing, whether that's in the award itself or on the FA form that comes from OSP, there's a chance that this could be set up incorrectly with GCA doing the invoicing. And I think the most common situation I see, and the one that is most difficult to untangle and correct, is an award that has split billing. So this is where a portion of the award is cost reimbursable or milestone for GCA to bill, but then there's another portion for patient costs, which should be invoiced by your department. And awards like this require a parent budget that is set up with the funds and then the expenditures for GCA to invoice, and a sub budget for the patient or department billed FOP 11 portion. So if you know any of your funding is patient related or to be billed by your department, please make sure OSP is aware so they can note it correctly on the FA. Next slide. Closing FOP 11 budgets. So since we don't invoice for FOP 11 budgets, we rely on your department to let us know when the study has been completed, if it's over early. If not, we will close it out after the final action date per our standard closing process. It's also important that your department ensures all costs have been billed and all payments have been reconciled and applied to the budget prior to requesting that GCA close it to status 4. If we're asked to close the budget early before all the payments have been received and applied, the process to reverse the closeout to reapply the payments is multi-step. And if the budget has been purged, we can't just go and reopen it to apply the payments. So please reconcile those budgets prior to requesting a closeout. And to piggyback on my reference to purged budgets, I do want to remind you that next June is biennium close. So most budgets in status 4 will be purged at that time. Next slide. Any questions?
There's nothing in the chat, Austin.
Thanks, Cheryl. All right. So I also have an advanced budget request reminder. We just want to remind everyone that requesting an advanced budget has multiple steps before GCA can begin to process the request. So the first two steps involve OSP. You'll want to ensure that your EGC1 is eligible for an advanced budget, and then you'll fill out the advanced budget request form in Sage. After you've created the form in Sage, you'll need to print it, obtain the required signatures, and submit it to GCA. We're able to match that PDF form up to the request in the Sage suite system that we use, which is called Sarah. But in order to do this, we need to receive the signed form. Some of you may not have access to a printer or scanner, so we do accept electronic signatures as well as email approvals. And if you're requesting a new advanced budget for like a brand new award, please submit the form via email to gcahelp@uw.edu. If your award is receiving a renewal, please upload the renewal advanced budget request form in Grant Tracker on the currently established budget. And the same goes for an advanced budget extension. So if you have an advanced budget set up, but the award hasn't come through yet and you need to extend that advanced budget, please upload that form in Grant Tracker as well. And once we've received the required documentation, barring any unforeseen issues, the turnaround time for an advanced budget is 1 to 2 business days. Next slide. Any questions about advanced budgets? I don't see any in the chat.
I don't either.
All right.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Azalea, and today I'm going to talk to you about mystery transactions that can show up on your budget. So we get a lot of inquiries into GCA Help asking for copies of JVs or invoices associated with charges on a budget. But most of these expenditures don't originate from our office. So right now you may be wondering if GCA isn't the right place to follow up with regarding a charge or a JV. How can I get a copy of backup documents or find out more information for my reconciliation? Today, I will walk you through a few helpful tips and tricks to make your search for backup documents and knowledge hopefully a bit easier and more successful. So to kind of know more about expenditures and JVs, we need to know where they came from. So for expenditures that post to your budget, it comes from various sources. So for example, payroll transactions originate from entries made in Workday. Outside services can come from Ariba or Procard. And internal services provided by other UW departments are posted via internal sales document or cost transfer invoice. Journal vouchers are the same way, but they are internal to the UW. They can be posted by various central offices like Student Fiscal Services, like for tuition, the Real Estate Office for rent, and GCA. Also, other departments can post JVs, for example, expense transfers. So on this next slide, I'm going to start off with how you can obtain a copy of a JV. So a few years ago, there was a big push to move away from paper JVs and to upload JV information electronically via FastTrans directly into the financial accounting system. So GCA actually stopped sending out paper copies of JVs to campus. Excuse me. However, because people still needed to review the JV that posted to their budget, UW IT created a report to generate the JV that was submitted in FastTrans in a similar format as the previous paper JVs. So where can you find this report? You can find it via the Business Intelligence Portal, also called the BI Portal. And the report is specifically called Journal Voucher Detail. And as you can see on this slide, here is a screenshot of how this report looks like. And so on the next slide, what I would like to do is to, can you hear me, Trish, now? Hello?
Yes, now I
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
sounds better.
Okay, sorry guys. Thank you, Trish. Okay, so
sure.
if this is your very first time using the BI portal to obtain a copy of a JV, I highly suggest that you go to the interpretation guide, which is a tab on that front page of the report, because it's going to give you a really nice detailed background about the report and about the parameters you would put in there. So you get the most out of this tool. So here you are, you pulled it up, you're ready to run your JV. So you would click that blue button that says run report. And then on the next slide, you'll be taken to this screen. And here you can put in the parameters of the JV that you found in My Financial Desktop. You've got a couple of things here, the posting date, the transaction end date, and then also a JV number. So you can actually look for more than one JV. So for example, if you wanted to look at all the JVs that posted for the month of October, you can just put that start and end date and the budget number, and all the different JVs pop up. So you don't have to just do one at a time. So when you're ready, you got your parameters in, go ahead and click that left hand side button that says view report. And then when you do that, what you're going to find is actually a copy of the JV that you're seeking. Here in this screenshot is a copy of a very popular JV that we always get asked about. It's usually when you first get your budget, and it's the JV that actually funds your report. So this is done by our budget setup group. And as you can see, only one line item is pulling up. That's actually very common. The other half of this JV is a general ledger account, and that is not something that campus has access to. So that's why it doesn't show up in these copies, and it's only central offices that have access to that account. So don't be concerned if this is all that you see. All right, so on the next slide, I'm going to teach you how to figure out who processed this JV. Now that you have a copy of it, it still doesn't answer your questions. So if you want to find out more, you want to go back to My Financial Desktop. And when you're looking at the particular transaction, it's actually a link. So if you click that Fund Revenue Award link on your budget, you're going to be taken into another screen. And on that other screen, you want to look for the originating area code, because that's who's going to tell you who processed that particular transaction JV. So in this example, you can see that grant and contracts code is GC, and it says grant and contract accounting. And usually once you see that, you know exactly who to go to. But pretend you don't know who we are and you want to find out, well, oh, who is this grant and contract accounting, and who do I contact? If you then click that originating area code, those words on this next screen, it shows a glossary. And so this is just a very small partial screenshot of that glossary. This glossary is quite long, and it's going to give you the value of the codes. And then so you just look for that code, and then you can see the contact information for that code / department on the right hand side. So then you can go ahead and contact any of these folks and ask them more information about that JV. All right, so on the next slide, I'm going to show you an alternative way to figure out who processed a JV. So if it doesn't have a link in My Financial Desktop and you still need to find out who did it, you can go to the Financial Reporting Journal Voucher webpage. And just to let you know, you will all get copies or have access to our slides. And in our slides embedded is a link. So you would just go to this slide, click that link, and it'll take you to that webpage. And then here on this webpage, it actually shows the JV code and the numbers, and then the corresponding departments and the contact information for those departments. So that's another alternative way to find out who created that JV. All right, on the next slide, as you know, last year, My Financial Desktop gave access to folks to process JVs in my financial desktop system. So it's going to look a little bit different than that first JV that I walked through because that was through FazTrans. If a JV is submitted in my financial desktop, it's pretty slick. So you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to open up MyFD, go to that particular transaction, which is also a link, and you're going to click it. And then on the next slide, you're going to be taken to this page, and there's going to be a small button, purple button that says Show MyFD JV. Once you click that, you're going to be taken to another screen, and bam, here's your JV. So this is just a part of the JV. So here you've got the date, the JV number, why it was prepared. I blocked out some of the information here, but you would actually have the full information and contact info of the people who did it, so you could contact them. And then as you scroll down on this JV, on the next slide, you'll see a continuation of the page. The department may have also added some backup documents, which you can view by clicking that green button. And then a copy of the JV is also attached here at the bottom. So that's pretty slick if the JV is processed through the My Financial desktop application. All right, next slide, please. Alternatively, if the transaction that you find in MyFD also has a clickable reference link, you can actually skip a lot of that details that I just went through and then click on that and I'll take you straight to the JV. All right. So on the next slide, I'm going to go through 3 other charges or entries in My Financial desktop that people ask us about all the time. So the first one is an internal sales document. The internal sales document is used by many of the UW service centers that provide services to campus. Same with cost transfer invoice. That also is a way that departments or other cost centers can charge for their services on your budget. And just to let you know, GCA will never process an ISD or a CTI. And then cash transmittal can be used by several places. GCA will use this because it's used to claim and apply revenue to your budget. So when Austin brought up like FOP 11, that's what our cash team would use if you send us a check and tell us to please apply it to one of your FOP 11 budgets. All right. So if you want to find out more information about these transactions, I'm going to show that to you on the next slide. Here, you can see a variety. You've got some ISDs and CTIs here. And as you can see, they have varying references. And so you actually want to use those to find out who created these entries on your budget. So I want to point out the 2 CTIs there in the middle. You can see that they actually have either an email address or a phone number. So you can go ahead and use those to contact those departments and ask them more about that charge if you don't know what that charge is, or if you need some sort of backup to put in your files for audit purposes. You can see for the ISDs, they don't have any contact information in the references. So what you want to do is you want to go back to the steps that I showed you for looking for the originating area code. Again, you would scroll, you would click on the links for the transactions and descriptions, and then scroll in the transaction detail to find that originating area code to then find the contacts. So hopefully that will be very helpful and successful in getting the information that you need. All right, next slide. Does anybody have any questions about the processes that I just went over?
I don't see any in the chat.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, so hi, my name is Liz. I'm going to be talking about common errors We were asked to, at our last forum, identify some common errors and mistakes that GCA sees. And so one of the most common area of error is invoicing. Next slide. So who submits the invoices? Is it GCA or me? We've noticed a little bit of confusion about who is submitting invoices on some awards. Most of the time, GCA will be responsible for submitting invoices. So exceptions to this rule are the FOP 11s and the clinical trials. So like Austin mentioned, your department is responsible for sending those out. If you're unsure about who is responsible for invoicing on your budget, please do not just send out your own invoices without notifying us. We want to try to avoid the duplicate invoices because it causes a lot of confusion with the sponsor and could end up in double payment, which is kind of a pain to refund. So be sure to pay close attention to your funding action and your award agreement. The FA will show you whether or not GCA is generating the invoices, and then your award agreement provides guidance on what information needs to be submitted along with each invoice. If additional backup or required documentation needs to be submitted with the invoice, we'll notify you guys via grant tracker once the invoice is ready, so you can attach that related backup and then submit to the sponsor. Next slide. Thank you. So a sponsor, some of the things that happened is like a sponsor will check with GCA because they have been expecting to see invoices, but they haven't received them. So we'll look into it and we'll go into the budget in Grant Tracker, and most of the time we'll see this list of Grant Tracker notes, which signals to us that there might have been some confusion about who should be doing what. So ultimately invoices weren't sent out. If you receive this Grant Tracker note, it means that we've determined there's additional information required in order to submit the invoice, or we have a prior agreement with your department to submit that you will submit the invoice. So either way, this note means that the invoice has been created, but it has not yet been submitted. So then we're expecting you from that point to review and submit with any required backup. So failure to submit the invoices will result in the sponsor refusing to pay, or it could result in the sponsor refusing to pay because they didn't receive it in a timely fashion. Next slide. So this is just an example of what the invoicing notification will look like. Invoices are available on Grant Tracker the following business day. We request that you notify us once the invoice has been sent to the sponsors so that we can begin tracking payment. It also helps us in case the invoice was sent out a lot later than we expected. So then we can go into our invoicing system and update that due date so that the delinquent payment notice doesn't go out. Common forms of backup documentation are labor hours that might need to be reported, travel receipts, equipment receipts, or purchases over a certain dollar amount. So we don't have access to those, so we do ask that you provide those. If you would prefer that GCA sends out the invoice along with the backup, just go ahead and attach the backup to the grant tracker and then include a contact name and information, so either an address or an email address of where the invoice should be sent. Next slide. All right, so we also see invoicing errors on milestone invoicing. So for milestone-based invoicing, the deliverables are entered into our invoicing system at the time of the award setup based off of what's outlined in your award agreement. On your funding action, you'll actually see a note that says that departments are responsible for notifying us once deliverables have been completed so that we can then invoice. So I'd like to just point out a new process change regarding the milestone deliverable communication that we'll be rolling out. So in the past, we would send multiple requests following up on the status of deliverables if we've seen that the date has passed and nothing has been completed. We received a little bit of feedback regarding this process, mostly that sending multiple requests was a little bit unnecessary and at times a little too much. So we are now going to just send one courtesy reminder for each deliverable a month before the due date. So we won't be sending up any follow-up requests. or checking in on it, we'll just send you that one reminder. If you reply back to our requests with an estimated completion date, we'll make note of this and then we'll follow up again with you at that time. Next slide. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this communication. We just contact you and ask you for an estimated completion date or a status update, just so we know how close or far away billing is. And then just be sure that when you reply to us that the deliverable has been met, that you're 100% certain it's been met. Invoices for incomplete deliverables have to be voided in our system. And it also causes some confusion with the sponsor because they're wondering why they received an invoice for work that hasn't been completed. Next slide. So are there any questions about the invoices?
I don't see any in the chat at this time.
Okay. So another common error that we see is just failure to respond to our grant tracker requests. Next slide. Thanks. So grant tracker is our main form of contact between us and you guys. So we use it pretty much for anything and everything. Most frequent uses are for addressing budget issues, sending out reminders, or communicating with you guys about invoices or reports. And then at the end of the award, we use it for closeout. A lot of times we see that budgets don't have their email contacts set up. So then we have to use our best judgment and take the contacts from the funding action, which isn't always accurate, and it's not always the person in charge of monitoring the budget. So the reason it's being brought up as a common error is just because sometimes we can't get a hold of anyone and our requests can just actually sit there for weeks or for months. And so it delays the invoicing reporting process and it keeps us from submitting them. And then it also just keeps budgets open longer than they should be. Next slide. So if you're ever unsure if you have set up your email contacts in your budget, just go ahead and go to Grant Tracker. Under email contacts, if you see this red notification or warning, it means that no email contacts have been set up yet. So just click on that blue link and add the contact details. It doesn't have to just be one person. You can add multiple contacts. And then also this is the same place you would go if you needed to update or edit a contact. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So these are just the most common types of grant tracker requests that we'll send out to try and communicate with you guys. You'll see that cost share is on there for both reporting and invoicing. It's a big one because sometimes we just cannot submit the report unless the most recent cost share information is updated. So we'll contact you to try and get that information updated. For other reporting and invoicing topics, we really rely on you guys to get back to us because we just don't have access to the same information that you do. So without a response, those reports or invoices may be delayed, and ultimately, if the sponsor decides not to pay, the deficit becomes the responsibility of the department. So for our closing related topics, we try to close these out within 120 days of the award end date. And if we don't hear from you, this delays that process, and then budgets that remain open for very long periods of time after their end date eventually are escalated for further action. So I'd also like to point out under Grant Tracker is that you guys receive email notifications letting you know that something has been updated or it needs a response. Sometimes there are Grant Tracker notifications that say no action necessary, but I would just get into the habit of trying to open all of the Grant Tracker notifications, just because sometimes we do try to contact you regarding your budget, but we don't necessarily need a response back, but there is some important information in there. So we just want to make sure that you've seen our message. So I guess just to close this out, don't ignore our Grant Tracker requests. They're usually pretty important, so try to stay on top of them if you can. If you're ever unsure of an answer or anything that we've asked you, that's totally okay. Just let us know, like either you're confused or you're just not quite sure, and we'd be happy to work with you and the sponsor to try and figure things out. And next slide. So any questions about Grant Tracker or those email contacts?
There is a question in the chat.
Okay.
Do we need to set up fiscal contacts for each individual budget, or is it based on org code?
I believe it's every single budget, unless I'm wrong, if someone wants to tell
You
me.
can, yeah, I think that you can choose to set it up for each budget, but you can also update multiple budgets by searching by org code or PI.
Okay, perfect.
But it's like, yeah, I think you'd have to select them all under that org code.
And that's correct, but it's pretty simple to do so once you get that org code list pulled from the org code reports. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you for virtually visiting with us today. You can contact us via the Grant Tracker system, via email to gcahelp@uw.edu, or you can leave us a message on our phone line, 206-616-9995. We do get a message when someone leaves us a voicemail there, and we try to follow up with those as quickly as we can. Our next forum will be in February of 2021. And we will let you know when this forum's slides and recording have been added to our website. And we'll also be sending you a survey that we'd love it if you complete it and let us know what you thought and what you might like to see more of. And it looks like there's a few things in the chat and I don't have it up on my screen. So Austin, can you let me know if there's any more questions in there?
No questions, just a lot of thank yous.
Well, thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you guys out there. We appreciate you.